I will start with Asif Kapadia. And this is your first foray into immersive. I'm sure, have all seen Asif's work before in both narrative and feature form, as well as the incredible Amy and Senna. Asif is an Oscar-winning filmmaker. And perhaps you could cue up your film Laika. We are going to show a trailer shortly, but why immersive and why now?
So, hi everyone. Mine was an unusual one because I was actually commissioned in a way. I was asked to make a film, not coming from this background. So, Tricia from the LFF and John Wardle, who runs the Immersive Centre at the NFTS, got in touch with me. And so in between long films, I always like to make short films still. Yep. I quite like to experiment. So the idea of doing something, I'm kind of cynical. I'm not into 3D. I like cinema. I'd never really loved kind of wearing headsets. I've got bad stigmatism. I'm short-sighted. So I'm the anti all of this person, which is why the reason to ask me to do it was, can I make a film that I bother watching? You know, I would get to the end without taking a headset off. And so that kind of is where it began. And then it was a really interesting journey into it of learning how to actually write something when you don't have a frame. Like, how do you write down a shot? How do you know, that process? The film ended up being made during lockdown, so none of us could meet. So that was quite a challenge. So I couldn't even turn a headset on, talk about download a film onto the headset. So just the process of making it was a big learning curve. But we've made it. It's now been showing in cinemas around the country. It's been really, really interesting and a great experience. So I may well have been converted.
You heard it here first. Right, shall we see the trailer of Laika, please?
Today at 5:30 a.m., Soviet scientists successfully launched into space a second artificial satellite, Sputnik 2.
A new recruit?
Yes, sir.
Excellent.
On board Sputnik 2 is a living animal. A dog called Laika.
My little Curly.
Oh, that last line. How many people have seen Laika yet? Oh, quite a few. Yeah, that line just gets me every time. We'll come back to talking a bit more about the film, but I would now like to welcome May Adballa and Barry Jean Murphy. And you have made the amazing Goliath, which we also funded, and which is showing here now. So actually, your work being screened here right now is actually another jumping off point. It was like it being released, and your work being screening here for a week, specifically to connect with Mental Health Awareness Week. Can you talk a bit about Goliath, and then let's cue up the trailer? And you don't come from a traditional film background, do you? You come into immersive from a different perspective. You're much more, can I say the word immerse? Is that a cliche? Yes, please, what would you like the audience to know?
Well, just maybe a bit of context, because before either of us were working in immersive, we were both filmmakers, and so there is still a passion for storytelling and things that get you and keep you and take you somewhere and know how to do that journey. And I think that's why working with BFI was particularly good for us, because the first time we had the conversation with someone at BFI, was okay, yeah, you'll ask us about the story, not just about the interaction. But anyway, so Barry, would you like to talk a bit about Goliath?
Yeah, well, May's a documentary filmmaker, with the BBC in the past and other productions. I come from an animation background, but I've done kind of animated documentary But I think that Anagram as a studio, their kind of like their modus operandi is to work with technology in a kind of unusual way and make technology speak for itself. Only make it for a reason, and that's why Goliath was made in VR, was because it is about realities, it is about perceptions, it is about breaking the fourth wall in that way. And
so yeah, just a bit of context. So Goliath it's a documentary. It's an interactive, animated experience, and it tells the story of a man who is a gamer who experiences psychosis. And so this, we'd made a couple of VR pieces before, and as Asif was saying earlier, it's sometimes quite demoralizing how hard it is. Oh, sorry, not to put anyone off. It's great, yes. But it's a real, every part of it is inventive. And so we had this kind of opportunity to make another VR piece, and we had this very frank conversation, which is well, if this is our last VR piece, because you don't know how many, what's the most appropriate story? And then, Barry, who the main protagonist in it is a friend.
He's a close friend of my, is a brother of my close friend, and the idea was floating around for years, even before VR was on the market, but then when the chance to go and pitch at the Venice Biennale College, which is a really excellent resource that you should look into if you're interested, is me and May just decided that this idea could really work, and the more we started to talk to people about the idea, the more it caught fire, and the more people got it. It had a very simple truth to it at the very beginning, which really helped sell the idea.
Should we have a look at the trailer, please?
Can you tell the difference between what is and isn't real? When the one thing that links you to the outside world disappears, where does that leave you?
Schizophrenia is not a proven illness. It's something that I understand that you can't tell what's real and it isn't real. Disruptiveness and having unusual thoughts, having your thoughts kind of... I do recognize the difference between myself and other people in some respects.
Everything you see is just part of the game.
A distortion.
Everything you feel...
Now I sound like a crazy person.
...is real.
And now I would like to welcome Erfan Saadati, and you are here representing Child of Empire. So what would you like the audience to know about you and your work first before we see the trailer?
I guess to start with the idea, to be in BFI talking about our work 7 years ago when all this started, when we were in basements of bars, showing each other our films, VR films. The idea of being here and talking about it, pretending to talk about it, pretending to know what I'm talking about in front of so many people I find inspiring. It was a dream. Now in those fantasies, I was the Oscar winner, but it's pretty exciting to be here. But it's all down to all the lovely people that are most of them are in this room. This VR community has been very tight knit in the last since its creation. So yeah, it's exciting to be part of this, I guess, the film world now and be taken seriously. In terms of the Child of Empire, it started off with my co-creator, who's not here, unfortunately. He's in Melbourne or something. But it started with him just wanting to take his granddad back to, so it's about the partition. I don't know how much you guys know about that, but he wanted to take his granddad back to his ancestral home. And yeah, so he just wanted to make something like VR, and I'm a VR dude, so we just sort of met up, started talking, and then we decided to make a bigger documentary. So 3 years went on, many scripts were written, many prototypes were built, and eventually we're here. Yeah, there's not that much to say. I would also say that if I knew the trailer would be shown at BFI, I would have spent more than 2 hours on it. But
let's just call it a work in progress.
Yeah.
Okay, let's have a look.
ये दाग दाग उजाला ये शब कजीदा शहर ये दाग दाग उजाला ये शब गजीदा शहर वो इंतजार था जिसका.
That's pretty good for 2 hours work, I think I can safely say. So let's come back to you, Asif. So what the Laika is based on a book. So where did the inspiration? When did you know? Did you start with the book first, and is that what unlocked the idea of actually I can figure out making immersive film, or did you start with the ambition and then find the material?
I originally wanted to do a 360 film where I was going to travel the whole world filming on another longer project. And I thought, while I'm doing this longer project, I'll take a 360 camera and I'll shoot this VR film, this AR film. And then as I did a bit of research and went to the kind of immersive center at the National Film School and watched films, I just thought maybe I'm not using the technology to the ultimate if I do a 360 film, and I should create the world, create the space so that you can move around within it. So that's when I switched over and I started thinking about, okay, which stories to tell. And the graphic novel, Laika, I knew of it because I'd met the author quite a few years ago and had actually I considered doing an adaptation as a straight animation. But I know nothing about animation. I know nothing about it. So I was like, I don't know how to do that, but I like the story. So then I contacted the author, Nick, who's a Londoner from Brixton, but he lives in New York. And I said, look, I never managed to get the longer film off the ground, but would you be interested in doing an adaptation of a part of Laika in a VR way? And he was really up for it. So then together, we worked on it together. So we co-wrote and he was on board all the way through. So I really let him worry about the look of the characters. And he was very strong on kind of wanting to not make it too Disney, not wanting to make it too kind of the dog should not just be a dog. It's not got big eyes and kind of full of character. It should just be a dog. And so things like that, we were quite good at working closely. We co-wrote it, essentially worked together from beginning to end. And that was really, it gave me kind of the story to work with. And I like the idea somewhere deep down. I think whenever I make a film of any form in whichever format, something about the story should be kind of a part of the journey of making the film. And in this case, it felt right that if it were not for Laika, we wouldn't have Wi-Fi or the internet or VR headsets. You know, that dog sets off the space racer. So I like the idea of this story is inherently a reason why we have VR. So that was the other reason for doing this story.
And you have a totally different framework of considerations than you do for making a narrative feature or a documentary in a more trad form. So what did you learn the hard way?
To be honest, all of it was the hard way. But it was working with Nick, working with Katie's here from Passion Pictures. So we worked with Passion Pictures with the animation company. So Katie and Passion introduced me to various people who were the kind of the animators and the designers. And there was a guy called Dave who came on. It felt quite late in the day, who sort of saved us, because Dave and I would then joke that we spent 3 years working on the film. 2.5 years we discussed how long the script was, and then we had 6 months to make it because we had a deadline of the LFF. And then suddenly we made it comparatively quickly, but there was a lot of talk about my script was always too long because we couldn't afford to do it and because of the budget. And I was like, well, what do you mean? Show me. And then we just went round and round in circles because the script was about 25 pages long probably. And everyone kept saying, people who know much better than I do, no, a VR film cannot be in more than 10 minutes. And I'm like, why not? We can't be. Why not? And that went on for 2 years. And then eventually I cut the script down and we ended up, And it was just like the process. Like I said, writing it down, I just thought, what's the language? And I think I learned that it's more like theatre and you create a set and the action takes place on a set. But if there's not lots of dialogue, then like how do you describe where the user's going to be and what they're going to experience? So from the script to the actually, how do I download a version of the film onto my headset during the lockdown? And how do I give notes? Because every time I lifted the headset up to write something down, it'd restart at the beginning. I'm like, this is not functioning, right? How do I make notes to say, at this point, I want to change? Like stupid things like that. Everything was if you're not used to it, everything's tricky. Like there's no time code when you're watching it. You go, well, how can anyone not in a room with me know which bit I'm talking about and where the hell in the frame it is if you can't in any way show them? I don't know. Maybe everyone else knows. Tell me. I don't know.
Well, we had to get a developer to put time code in it, basically.
Wow.
Time code, no chapters, you think, oh, maybe there needs to be
You're
chapters.
making it as you go along. Like,
You have to invent the kind of technology.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to put in documentary footage and have layers. And again, that was kind of a challenge. But we kind of got there in the end. But also, just the final part of it was right at the very ending. I never heard the sound until we actually presented it here at the LFF. I never had a version with the audio and the picture together until we screened it here, because it just wasn't possible to play it all out.
Right.
So I was hearing the soundtrack, but most of the time we were looking at a picture which just had the dialogue and no other effects and things. So it's kind of a weird kind of experience, but we somehow got away with it, I think.
Yeah, you definitely got away with it, I think.
We learned along the
Safely
way.
say.
Yeah. It's good to have a deadline, actually. And
Barry and May, you're as you said, Barry, you're the jumping off point was perhaps the person, a real person and real testimony, which we hear throughout the film, and then but we also have another voice, and we really, the word immersive is really particularly, I think, relevant to your piece, because you really do feel the experience and you live the experience. And it's really, really, I found it incredibly moving. I found all of the pieces incredibly moving in different ways. But can you talk particularly about you're working real testimony, and you're in a way representing the deep inner workings of and rebuilding your idea of someone else's world.
Yeah.
That's kind of very profound, but also quite a big responsibility, as sort of documentary work always is. Talk about that.
We definitely felt very responsible and didn't want to portray the wrong type of experience about mental illness and psychosis, namely because a lot of media has in the past, and so our kind of one of our pillars was to kind of not do that. And we kind of researched a lot. We read it, listened to a lot of podcasts, listened to a lot of books, read books, just accounts of it, and just that fed into it. We did quite a lot of research in that way.
And then, May, can you talk about the other voice, the voice of Goliath, and where that comes from?
Tilda.
Yes.
Like Barry was saying, we were doing this research into what does it really feel like to have psychosis as this kind of moment when reality is very fragile. It could be a number of different things, and we really wanted to not to make kind of a documentary where it really others that community, or it talks about invites you to pity somebody. And the reason we love John as a character is because when he streams online, he's constantly making jokes. He takes the piss out of himself all the time, and we're this is not, we don't want to make this kind of sub story. We want to actually really invite you to be do you know? Are you always sure that you know which side of real and unreal you're on? And so the character that is there's this kind of trope. It's not really a trope. It's just whenever you start a VR experience that is interactive, there's a kind of you learn how to use, it's kind of in games, right? Left key, platform jump, a space bar. And so we thought, well, we'll use that because we kind of have to use it. But what if we kind of make that actually a bit philosophical? And Tilda Swinton basically plays this character who is kind of slightly teaching you, but also maybe mocking this idea, not mocking necessarily, but just kind of inviting you to be at what point are these things that are plastic going to just be your hands? And will you notice when that becomes a thing? Because that's kind of, I think a lot of the ways in which we, similar, I guess, is you just have to do VR over and over and over again to understand what it is that you take from it, and no one else's experience is really relevant. It's kind of you got to find your own voice. And I think that thing of using the kind of physical excitement and kind of confusion that you sometimes have in VR when you're told to catch a ball and suddenly you know the ball's not there, but you like have this adrenaline rush, like I have to catch the ball. I caught the ball because my like controller buzzed and it felt like a ball. So kind of, yeah, using Tilda as this kind of playful guide who both tells you what to do and reassures you, because there are some moments which are quite unnerving for people, but also reminds you that like perhaps you are somebody who is not as sure of reality as you think you are.
Yeah, that you're being fooled, because one thing the viewer tells you is that people are fooled easily, you know, like just remove the floor and they get like unstable, and it doesn't take long before your brain completely just follows that line, and we wanted people to think about that, you know, in terms of the piece.
Yeah, we kind of kept calling it like breaking the fifth wall, or like kind of giggle about it, but then, you know, because Tilda just has like quite an amazing, gigantic brain, and she kind of could immediately see and like enters that role, as I'm sure, you know, anybody who's done it feels like really knowing, almost like she's reading your thoughts, kind of, because she'd said, oh, you know, I've done VR and I've actually already thought about all of these things, and so she really just kind of went with that idea that she was like the playful person inside and outside the fifth wall of VR.
Wonderful, thank you. And Erfan, can you talk a bit about the considerations you make towards you don't call it viewer, do you? It's user. Do we say user, viewer? Is this contentious?
Viewer, like visitor, there's a lot of words you can use, you know, like depends on how pretentious you want to get, but.
Okay. Yeah. The audience, let's just do the collective, the audience. Yeah, what considerations do you have to make? They're very different, one imagines, from when you're making trad 2D.
I think ultimately the fundamentals are the same. You got to keep people entertained, right? Like, especially when you're making documentaries, like especially when they're like social impact, you always have the risk that you're just gonna be like throwing facts at people, and it's gonna be like quite boring after a while. So it's just making like stories that people should care about interesting. I guess with our piece also there was like this big history component to it, right? Like the partition, which personally I'm Iranian, despite my looks, like I had no idea what it was. I didn't have like much interaction until I met Sparsh. So like what we started was like, okay, so we gotta like get people to a level where they will understand the story between the two survivors. So that's why we went with that like sort of cinema at the start, which you would have seen in the trailer a little bit. So we started with like a little history lesson, which was actually quite difficult because it's like 200 years worth of story. How are you gonna make that into like a minute or two? So there was a lot of back and forth, but thankfully there's a lot of historians and historian types on the project. So I didn't need to worry about that too much. I just needed to worry about making it look cool, which I guess to some degree worked out. But yeah, so I've made a lot of like, fair amount of like social impact VR stuff, I guess, or have worked on them as well. The one thing that I think me and my colleagues had gone like tired of was like the sort of like someone just talking at you for like a while. And like, again, like this is like in relation with 360 video as well. So like, I guess you didn't really have much interaction. So you just kind of feel like a passive passenger in all this. So I think the most innovative thing that we actually did on the project was have two dudes talk to each other, two survivors talk to each other, one from Pakistan, one from India. And like just by simply making it like a dialogue between two people, and this might sound very backward thinking for like the film people, but like just having that dialogue between two people rather than like a voiceover throughout, it almost makes you feel, or I hope it makes you feel like you're eavesdropping on the story rather than being told. So it makes this actual narrative a bit more engaging. The one thing, like again, like I've personally experienced in VR is that there's so much information being thrown at you, and I think, as I've said before, it's quite overwhelming. So you gotta like make sure that the narrative doesn't depend too much on the voiceover and narrator and the characters almost. I mean, you mentioned like theater. I like to call it creating worlds, because it's very much like, you know, yeah, as you say, you can't do like edit, or like, you can't do cuts, or you can't do cuts too often. So you almost create like your scenes become these worlds that you gotta like let the person explore for themselves. Now there are still ways to like direct people, I guess, and you know, like every experience that comes out, and every year more and more talented people are drawn into this industry, and they make better stuff than the people before them. But ultimately, like, you know, we're still at that like train coming at the screen, George Miller's like era. So like there is no set standards yet, right? So yeah, I guess the most innovative thing on this project that I was considering the audience for was making a dialogue between two people as opposed to people talking at you. And also like I think from my personal experience is that like VR works very well when you're like walking in someone else's shoes. Like I guess like that Goliath is a very good example of that because you're experiencing someone else's life, and this was like experiencing someone else's memory. And like, you know, we thought about like making it traditional, the film or the documentary, whatever you want to call it, but I don't know, like I struggled to like find a way to make the partition interesting to non-Asian people, because if you don't have any connection to the story, it's like, all right, it's just like another massacre that happened at some point in the last 100 years. So yeah, it's about figuring out it's about finding the right stories for the medium, or like find the right medium for the stories, I guess.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, I think we're ready now. I'm going to quit the stage and I'm going to hand over to our next host, Ulrich and KRISTIN. Please join me.
It's really, really exciting to be here and talk about sort of the aspirations that we have at the British Film Institute in immersive cinema, broader screen approach. And a little bit maybe my background, because I think that ties into the conversation. I'm not a film person. I have no idea whatsoever, so I'm very happy to sit here. My background is theater, visual arts, set design, so I'm really coming from another angle. And I think this is one of the things that is really, really interesting about this medium, immersive technology, let's put it that way, that it draws on from very different genres, very different backgrounds, and that also ties into the question, how do we present these works? Because with filmmaking, we know we can present it on a screen, we know how to showcase it, and with immersive, that is one of the biggest challenges we actually face. And in addition to that, also distribution. There's no real knowledge at this point how we distribute these works, because all of them are so completely different. And you already see it here on the panel. All of these works, even though they have more of a VR filmic component, and most of them are very sort of story-driven, many of the projects that we showcase, for example, at FF, come from a very different angle. They are more abstract, more experiential. And I think it's really a pivotal time at this moment, and this is why we as the British Film Institute want to engage in this and sort of bring all these different conversations together and hopefully inspire you guys to sit here next year on this panel and present your works. I think what I just said, one of the biggest challenges really is, on the one hand, how do we make these works that are so different in format, in texture, in stories? And the other one really is, how do I get it out in the world? How do I present it? And Trisha here has been really, really instrumental in helping us, especially for FF, to think about and give a playground how we present this work. And very early in my career, I started thinking about the combination of the physical world with the digital. And I think this is really, really important to all of these works, to root this, to contextualize it, and to frame it in a setting that how people can actually experience these works. And I think it's safe to say we're just testing waters at the BFI at the moment. So we are having these little testing grounds, especially here with BFI Expanded. We're really trying very, very different formats and things to showcase. And also the Film Fund. You guys have started to fund these projects that we're seeing now here. And KRISTIN, I'd like to start with a few questions to you. When did you actually start funding these projects, and what was the reasoning behind it? Can you tell a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it was probably around 2016, 2017. Ben Roberts, who was head of the Film Fund at the time, I think was really interested. He was really interested in this type of work. My colleague at the time, Mary Berg and Lizzie Frankie, were also kind of thinking about different screens, different ways of telling stories, how we engage with that. And I kind of was a casual gamer, and I was kind of thinking about, I was reading a lot at the time around kind of how interactivity and narrative often are in conflict, and interesting ways to kind of feel out how you tell stories and create emotionally engaging experiences with the technology that was kind of constantly evolving. So that's kind of how it came about. I think Ben was quite keen to start to become a bit more agnostic about screens and how we use them, because this is where audiences are going, and we want to kind of help support emotionally engaging, interesting, innovative experiences that feel more porous and more fluid. So as you say, we also started to dip our toe in the water, as other parts of the BFI did the same thing. And we've been blessed with amazing projects coming to us that we're kind of extraordinarily proud of. But this is kind of the starting point that we know that we come from film backgrounds, but also feeling like we share a lot of kind of similar intentions for audience.
So for all of the aspiring XR makers here in the room, what would be the process? So is there sort of different funding applications? Is it a year-round program? How does it work?
Right now, it's very similar to film. We have a development fund, we have a production fund. It's open call year-round. You can fill out an application form, send in supporting materials, pitch your project, and kind of the application process is a team kind of looking at it together, collectively deciding whether it's something that we feel like we can prioritize for public funding. So, obviously, the team's there to answer any questions, as we are very aware that immersive is just a different kettle of fish to how film works. But right now, it's the same application form.
Yeah, and I just learned also that at the end of the year, I think you have commissioned also a study to think about how did it work, the funding up until now, and how do we want to change the funding. How does the application have to change? And we also want to really talk to the creators, to you guys, and to understand what are the necessities. How do we need to be able to fund these things? And do you already have a reasoning in place how that's going to work to include the creators in that process, or is that just starting? Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I think it's sort of going to be an evaluation process that would absolutely include the creators, the sort of people in the wider landscape. I think there's a lot of fact-finding that we're interested in. As with film, the landscape feels like it's changing daily in terms of needs and where the gaps are, and where we feel like the BFI could kind of help support. So I think the intention is to be as sort of wide-ranging as possible.
Right. Yeah, I mean, these 3 projects have been funded by you guys, and maybe I can ask you, can you tell us a little bit more about the overall funding possibilities and what your feeling is, especially in the UK at this moment? How does it work? I know you have an opinion, but this is why I'm asking.
So what is the answer you're asking me to give? It's very complicated. I mean,
that's the right answer.
Yeah, it's very complicated, and it's good that there is this kind of slightly simpler approach that you guys have. And can I ask a question? Who in the room is a creator?
Great.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's exciting at the moment is that lots of people, like you guys, I mean, you've been dipping your toe in for a bunch of years, but like lots of people are dipping their toes in, and, they have a sense that audiences are biting. And so, I mean, I could kind of just list things, but, something Barry mentioned was that as a creator, sometimes it's more important that you find a place that you can experiment rather than try and kind of pitch a grand idea, because actually pitching the grand idea is, just being able to not be in a situation where like you don't have ownership over the tools and developers are kind of bewildering you is like, it's very tough, like from an artistic point of view, to not have a feel and like know what you think is important. So it's, there used to be Creative XR, which, I'm going to keep saying that until they bring it back. But like the key, finding, and the National Theatre does, Immersive Studio does short residencies, which they sometimes put money towards, and they understand that they also, like you guys, are like, how do our set designers and lighting people also skill up and understand how they could use their skills in that space? and so there's kind of the Arts Council, but it is pretty bewildering at the moment, and sometimes we were funded by you guys and also Meta, which was then Facebook, and like that was a very we were extremely lucky because they have the platform. In fact, in many ways they are the platform, which is its own kind of we want more platforms, and so there are you kind of need your producers to like think kind of extremely creatively. Do you become quite interested in a particular piece of hardware and then convince the people who own the hardware to let you experiment because they need content as much as you need money, to be honest.
So on the one hand, it's really about the safe space, if I understand correctly, for R&D and really trying out things. Yeah. But then really it's the nitty-gritty. You need the headsets, you need the developers. So there needs to be funding in place. And from, I think, one of our conversations we had earlier, I think, I can say that because I come from Germany, as you can hear. I think sometimes it's really difficult to navigate here in the UK. There's very different funding bodies, and sometimes I think it would be really great if they could connect a little more, or maybe lead paths for creators to pave the way for people to understand how the funding actually works.
No, I was like, the list. I mean, in a way, you've got to get hold of that list. In fact,
someone has to write it.
You guys should write it. I mean, that's why it's really important that you're in the game, because ultimately, the UK are very proud of its creative industry, and it only really got here because there was really great moments in history where we funded exploratory time for artists and expecting the creators to kind of come up with the idea, make the tools, build the institutions that are going to show that has never really been the process. So it is really lots of people coming together and evolving it. What's really good, I just sort of find things what's great about being here and just having spent a day watching people come in and out of Goliath. It's it's on the South Bank. There's someone who's just in London for a day because it's her birthday, wants to try something out. Elderly people who are asking me to carry their babies while they go into headsets. There's this real. I really love the fact that you are in a kind of conversation, with audiences where we're teaching each other what tools, editing. Editing language didn't just get invented because somebody thought of Avid. The idea, the conversation you have when you're editing a film, instantly that shot is long. That's a long shot. That must mean there's something in the suitcase. We're really advanced in the nuance of that, and as it's definitely anybody who kind of invents a trick now has a possibility of putting that, being the Fellini of of that moment, because then everybody's going to say, we understand that language, we understand what that must mean suspense, or that must mean thrill. So it is.
There are no auteurs in VR yet, I guess, but yeah.
Well, that's us. No, but it's just a real, this is the moment where those things get defined, and some of the reasons you might look at it, there's a simplicity to it, and I think it's a simplicity because the language is developing, and as the language gets complicated, you can do more and more things with nuance. That's very exciting.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the one part is obviously it's the funding to get the whole thing off the ground, and the other thing is really to get it to the people, the distribution. And as I mentioned before, I think sometimes it's really challenging to showcase these things, so we're really trying out new versions. And Asif, you've just, you said so nicely, the full circle with Laika. So we showcased it here at LFF Expanded in last October. And now you've made a tour through the UK, which I find really, really great, to the Fan Network. And we're now showcasing Laika again here. Can you tell us a little bit what you experienced on that tour and how it actually came about? Because I could be one of the models to distribute things to a wider audience.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting because, we were in the country almost coming out of COVID, and the idea of trying to get people to go back to cinemas. And we did a tour of cities it was Bristol, Cardiff, Nottingham, Sheffield. What have I missed? Just a couple more. No, we haven't been to Glasgow yet, but a couple others, sorry. And a lot of these cinemas would be the places that I may have been to with previous feature films. So there was an element of audiences who kind of knew me or knew my other work, and then they'd come along, and we came up with like this routine, which would be there'd be a screening, and then there'd be a Q&A. And it was really interesting that the audiences did want to have a collective experience, even though they're watching a VR headset on their own. And each screening that we had, the amazing team from kind of Virtual Umbrella, Bertie and his team, we learned something on every screening. So the first time when we showed it here at the LFF, everybody had to put on a headset and you have to look in a certain place to start it. And what that meant was if you've got 25 people, it started at 25 different times, and there'd always be someone that's 10 minutes behind everyone else. So it would finish and we're waiting for the one last person. And we'd all clearly just be sitting there. So we had to learn about that. The batteries used to run out. So halfway through the experience, the battery would run out. So then we had to put on batteries. So every single screening, the team learned something to try to make it a kind of more unified experience. And in the end, everyone puts on a headset, we press play, they all run at the same time, they all have batteries, they all stop at the same time, and then we have a chat about it. And so many of the audience said they just liked the idea that they were coming to a cinema, which they feel comfortable in, that normally shows the films that show their taste, so they trust the cinema, and then they come in to watch a VR film and they may have heard of something that I've done before. And so, yeah, it was really enjoyable. And, you know, I don't know for everyone else, but for filmmakers, the thing that I'll say it quite, streamers will never have the thing of somebody reacting to your work. Sure. You make something because you want to affect the audience, and to have the audience in the room reacting, to have a conversation with the audience afterwards, that's what makes me want to make more work. You know, it isn't just this idea that someone signed a check and then it went off and you have no idea if anyone ever saw it. So even though there were sometimes quite small screenings, it was quite intimate and really enjoyable. Yeah, and I have not travelled the country since, you know, COVID. So to be getting on a train and going up to Sheffield and going to all these cities and watching the movie, watching people watch your movie is a bit weird. But that's what we did a lot of time of, was watching them watch it. So there's always one watching the other way, looking. They're all looking there and there's one person looking up. But that's a part of it. That is all a part of it. So yeah, it was, hopefully it's the start of things to come. You know, I think there's a place for VR in galleries, in cinemas, collectively watching films on your own, but you're there in a space with other people.
That's the exciting thing, I think, about the format, that we just about start to find ways to distribute it or how to bring it to the audience.
Also, just it's the technology, because the idea that we had been sort of tasked with is to get people who've never tried a VR headset before. So if you've got someone who's never done it before, you can't expect them to do the tech. You just give them a headset, give them the headphones. If there's a problem, raise your hand. The Genius team, they set it up. And so it meant it was quite seamless. And therefore, people are not put off for life from doing it again. You know, that's hopefully the intention.
Yeah, for sure. Erfan, we just talked about sort of distribution and funding possibilities. And your project, I think, is very special around this, because you got this whole impact campaign around it. And I think probably that's also a possibility to get some of this funded, or how to bring it to audiences in a different way and with extra materials, etc. Can you elaborate on that, what you're planning on, or what the actual experience will be?
Yeah, of course. I guess to some degree the project is all around the 75th anniversary of the partition, which is happening in August. And thanks to Sparsh mainly, the co-creator, he's managed to get a traveling exhibition that goes some of the most exciting venues in London and across the world, actually, India, Pakistan, UK, US, across UK. I'm not sure how much I don't know how many of them have been confirmed, so I'm not gonna name any specific venues. But yeah, thankfully that this project has obviously the cultural side of it. So museums and whatnot are interested in showcasing it for at least August. But I think for the wider VR industry, I think the two questions before were funding and distribution. But I think the two are linked, right? Until we figure out the distribution, the people who actually have the money, and not saying that government bodies don't have the money, but ultimately I think until we figure out how to distribute these experiences so that people can monetize it, we won't really see the kind of budgets that we need to see to make experiences that are worth watching. Not that our experiences aren't worth watching, but I think whenever I've been to a VR event, it's always been booked out and sold out, and they could be charging anything from 10 to £40 for them. which also gives it that like that side of it. Like if you respect your experience to actually not make it like to make it a ticketed thing, people will come and like will pay for it, and like if you get the right marketing behind it, like how much money have we paid to go watch Marvel films just because the marketing was good? Like like it's the same principle, like ultimately like we've been very blessed in UK because there's so many different government bodies that are funny, and like people from the US come all the time here and say like you guys are so lucky to have actually people like just give you money because of you're British.
Tax credits.
But like ultimately, I think that actually the money is probably best spent in the infrastructure than it is on like specific projects, right? Because ultimately, but ultimately, like if it is taxpayer money, and like at the end of the day, if I don't like the content, and you're like, well, like we funded that, but ultimately, if the infrastructure is there, like I think like China has quite a good model where like they actually have VR headsets at cinemas and they're like monetizing it. Mm-hmm. So like when you have that going on, you got like actually producers and I think brands also could be a part of like actually funding like decent budget stuff that people will actually want to go and watch and experience because of its entertainment value, not because it's it's the 75th year anniversary of the partition necessarily, but like it's gotta like be like entertaining for the viewers ultimately, and yeah, I think we got a long way to go, and like not that we're like, as I said before, like 7 years ago we were like in basements of bars like showing each other the films, and like now we're at BFIs, which is like a huge leap. I think one of the downfalls of VR has been that it keeps getting compared to film, whereas like films had like over 100 years of development to get to this point. I don't think people were like sat in the first like in the 1890s like watching. Everyone was like in the cinemas wondering why aren't we making more and like better stuff, like wondering, oh, the quality is just not there, it's a little fuzzy. I think it gets a lot of like misguided criticism, but at the end of the day the viewers have to be entertained.
Can I just say one quick thing? Sorry, I don't know how much time we have, but like what is a particular challenge and like or opportunity is that VR is actually loads of industries mixed up together, and so like to see any of the projects that are here, you've got extremely specialized people in like animation who are used to animation pipelines and sound teams, like the fact that you didn't hear your sound kind of mixed spatialized before, like all of that stuff is to develop like software is like a really particular industry. People like doing things in a very particular way. You will effectively piss everybody off when you try to make VR, and it's one of the really like Story Futures does a lot kind of working around this stuff, but like you kind of need to have we need to be like in rooms like this for like lots of different industries to kind of bring the right, because actually like maybe not everyone in this room, you're going to need to go and find like lots of other people to start making your project, and how do we actually them about that? Yeah, how do we actually like excite all the people that you need? And it's really cool because it's very, very collaborative in that way. Yeah.
I think we were saying this earlier in another conversation, this immersive needs to get a home in a way. So you say there's very different industries, that's true, but it would be nice to have this home where this work is being cherished and it's supported. And I think that's part of why we're actually here to find this little home.
Tirelessly. But we had a very good producer on board, Anita, and she organized quite a lot of testing, and we codified our testing, and we tested as many people as we could, and we had a spreadsheet of everyone's feedback and feedback forums, and we reviewed that and took it to heart and went back in and found a solution. That's how we did it. But it's from the very beginning, it's really important to hit the ground running with your grey box, with your what you think is your complete idea as rough as possible, so people can start looking through it. And that never happens in cinema. Yeah, you get a testing audience at the very end, but yeah, it's at the very, very beginning that you want to start bringing the people into it.
To some degree, I think that's probably because all of our films were animation rather than 360 film, which I think also is like as an art form is like there. Like I think people forget that 360 film can be as powerful as VR or like animation stuff, because like when we film stuff, it's exactly the same as film. You know, you film what you got. Like there's no iteration because you got what you got. But like I guess when it's animation, you have like endless possibilities as long as you have animators that will put up with your like constantly changing your mind.
I'm just laughing. I don't even know what iteration means, and that's how I'm like.
I mean, the fact that you
I'm going to just keep quiet until someone's. Yes.
So yeah, 2.5 years on the script is a long time without having made something. So like I guess it's that thing. So we had like an illustrated, like a paper drawn like wraparound animatic. So we were like, the first thing was like the animatic, which is just like the worst possible. But you learn a lot.
Drawings.
Like you just because the other thing that's worth mentioning is like doing that testing is that people don't like. It's really interesting because you're not really asking people their opinions necessarily. You're just watching what they do. And like one of the things, you know, even quite late in the day, we realized that, we just have too much in it. We have like too much interaction. People can't follow what's going on. Like you kind of ended up taking, which is not a very financially like sound way of doing something. You have to not have got to that point, to be honest. But so yeah, like you just think, how do you know that this idea is going to work? Because you have to find, even if, I think at some point we were really desperate because it was COVID and we were so used to working together in the studio. We like met in a park and we like wrote on pieces of paper what was going to be in the space. And we just like put it around us and like read out the script. And it'd be like, how can we just kind of really quickly, without like losing 10 grand, just work out what the rhythm and the feel of this story is. And so like that's what like
we actually didn't do any like audience testing, I don't think, till the end, but like it's, I think as a filmmaker or like director or like storyteller, ultimately you want to make something that you want to watch, right? And you're always going to be your biggest critic and you're going to hate your work more than anyone else. So as long as it passes your test, ultimately, I think that's the answer, right?
It's just a shout out to they don't need a shout out, but you know, the FI Center in Montreal. So like in a way they're kind of like a global model, heavily funded independently. Like they didn't start off with a business model, but you know, they do a lot of curation of this kind of work, but they also did this thing during lockdown, which was VR to go, which is kind of like your blockbuster movie version where you'd get a headset loaded with kind of curated films. Because the thing is, if you buy a headset and you're like, I'll just go to the Oculus store, like after you play Beat Set, you know, we're here because like we have an aesthetic, we want a particular kind of thing. So yeah, like
get your CD
love
in
film.
the post.
Yeah.
I love film. Yeah, yeah.
So like,
Love
and then you kind of, and that's like quite an interesting model in terms of how, yeah, like I don't know all of the maths, but that was interesting in terms of like you get it for a week, it gets sanitized and then sent on.
And also to circle back to what Ulrich was saying, I mean, obviously all these films here now is like they're all VR, but like there's way more to like the immersive industry than just VR, I guess. Like there's like the projection mapping stuff. I don't know how many of you have seen that like Van Gogh thing that was happening all around London. Like £30 a ticket for that, like it did seem steep, but like so many people went to it. So as long as you make it exciting for people and you make it an event, I think that's where the difference between immersive and film comes. Like people for film, they just go see that story because they've seen like the hype behind it. So you got to create that hype, I guess, ultimately.
Yeah, we have to develop audiences, basically, and this is what these organizations do. And you just said like what the Watershed does, and I think it's really interesting to think about ways to incorporate this distribution model in the funding process. I mean, we're here to talk about film funding, and I think that will be something we'll be discussing definitely within the BFI.